amazing how many times I'll talk to people about the NIH and tell them you have a hospital in this. There's a hospital at the NIH. It's an amazing place. Discoveries are being made all the time. It's an absolute honor for me to work on this campus and to work with some of the brightest minds in the world in the field of medical science. And I think of Carl Sagan, who once said, somewhere something incredible is waiting to be known. And literally every week we'll hear about some kind of discovery and sometimes breakthroughs that are occurring on this campus. The hospital that's called the Clinical Center opened in 1953. It has over a 200-bed capacity. Everybody that's treated in that hospital is on a experimental research trial. And that doesn't mean that everything that they receive is experimental, but they may get a standard of care treatment plus something new to try to improve outcome. We have 1,200 credentialed physician scientists that take care of patients there. And the best thing about this hospital is that all care is free of charge. So we cover patients' travel, we cover lodging, we cover all pharmacy expenses. Nobody has ever received a bill that's ever been cared for at this place, nor would we even know how to make a bill. Congress about 10 years ago said, we want you guys to charge something. This is, people have to give something back. And so we tried for a couple of months to figure out how to bill, and it got so complex. And Congress changed, and we were able to continue to offer care for free. In terms of the research protocols that we have, we do high-risk, high-reward research. Our expression is, if somebody else could do it, don't do it at the NIH. The goal is to push the envelope to try to come up with new treatments, new diagnostics that have never been done before, and if successful, potentially could become standard therapies in the future. I want to list some of the very important discoveries that have occurred at the NIH Clinical Center, and I think that probably most of you will be shocked when you hear this because these are really important discoveries that impact the health of all of us. Cancer as an effective therapy for chemotherapy was first tested and proven to be effective for Hodgkin's lymphoma at the NIH. The Framingham Heart Study, I'm not sure if any of you have heard of that, but Framingham Heart Study is part of my institute, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And that study studied patients longitudinally, now more than 75 years, and was the first study to ever show cholesterol and blood lipids were associated with cardiovascular risk. The association of smoking with heart attacks was established from the Framingham Heart Study. The association of hypertension with the risk of heart attacks and strokes was established from that study. Hepatitis C was discovered at the NIH by Harvey Alter, who won the Nobel Prize 4 years ago for that discovery. The fact that immunosuppression could treat autoimmune diseases, that was a discovery. Fluoride, so every day when you get up and you brush your teeth, your dental hygiene is improved because of research that occurred at the NIH. Lithium for depression, immunotherapy to treat cancers. The first treatments for HIV were developed at the NIH. The first treatments for Ebola, including vaccines and monoclonal antibodies, were developed there. The first vaccine for human papillomavirus was developed there, which has saved tens of thousands of lives, preventing cervical cancer. And the first vaccines for COVID-19 were developed at the NIH. So when I came to the NIH as a clinical fellow in oncology, my goal was to get trained in oncology and then to spend a couple of years doing research in the field of tumor immunotherapy. And I was really struck by the concept that you could use the human immune system to treat cancers, particularly solid tumor cancers. And I had seen patients that were getting allogeneic stem cell transplants where you would transplant a healthy immune system and stem cells from a donor into a patient could have leukemias regress through something that we call graft versus leukemia, graft versus tumor. So I asked a very simple question, and that was, could we get a transplanted immune system from a healthy donor in a person with a metastatic cancer to see that cancer and be able to induce tumor regression? So the way that we do these hypothesis testing questions is that we typically will do something in vitro to confirm or establish the hypothesis before we bring it to humans or develop it in a preclinical animal model. So I worked with mice, and before I go to our mouse experiments, the first point I wanted to say, particularly for the students, is that when I came to the NIH, we had thinkers that were within the box and outside of the box. And this concept of transplanting an immune system to get the tumor to shrink was definitely outside of the box, but innovation comes largely outside of the box. So I would encourage you, if you have ideas that don't fit here, to develop those ideas. So what I want to show you is out of the box. So in this model, we took kidney cancer cells and we injected them into a mouse. We gave the mouse radiation, and then we transplanted back the same immune system and bone marrow cells, called a syngeneic transplant, into those mice. And those mice had tumors that progressed into their lungs and ultimately proved to be lethal. In a follow-up experiment, we did the same exact thing, but this time, after we gave that radiation, we transplanted immune cells in bone marrow from a mouse that was partially matched. And in that model, we noticed that the tumors did not grow. So that was evidence on a mouse model that this immune effect could potentially target a solid tumor. So I went immediately from mouse experiments into experiments in humans. We wrote a clinical trial, and that clinical trial said if you have metastatic kidney cancer, and if you have a brother or sister that are a partial match, we'll bring you to the NIH, and we'll do a stem cell transplant on you to see if we get the same kind of immune effect. So we wrote that trial, and this is some of the early data that we published. So this is back in 1999, in a patient that had these big cannibal lesions, and this was what we saw pre-transplant. And then, long after the transplant was done, we started seeing tumor nodules shrinking up. This was the first establishment of proof of concept that a transplanted immune system could induce anti-tumor responses. Here's a patient with tumor nodules in the lungs, pre-transplant, day 270, shrinking up. This is a patient that had big hilar lymph nodes that were full of tumor and a mediastinal mass, and you can see also shrinking up. Here's a patient with a malignant pleural effusion and pulmonary tumors that disappeared completely by 1 year after the transplant. So I came to the NIH as a fellow in 1995. By 2000, we had established clear proof of concept that a transplanted immune system could do something really amazing in these patients that had otherwise lethal disease. So this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I was first author on that paper. All of my colleagues from the University of Florida that had sort of written me off became friends with me again and said, what in the world are you doing up at the NIH? And I said, this is an amazing place where they let you develop out-of-the-box kind of concepts. We treated 19 patients in this study. 10 patients had tumor regression. 3 patients had complete regression of cancer. Here's a patient. You can see all these tumor nodules in February 1998, starting to shrink a little by April, and then completely regress. And then here's the patient 20 years after the transplant with no evidence of disease. These kind of patients at that time had survival measured in 3 to 6 months. So this was really absolutely astounding to see this. Here is that patient right there in 1998. That's me with a goatee, not regulation, and with dark hair. Here's that patient in 2007. When he came to the clinic, he had talked to me about his daughter and that he knew he was going to die, and that his biggest regret was that he was not going to get to see his daughter grow up. And here he is, almost 10 years later at her wedding. And here he is in 22 years after the transplant. So some really, amazing responses. Here's a patient in 2001, and here he is in 2022. And bringing that picture to show me how old I had become. Making fun of me, and I said, yeah, your hair's just as great. So the next thing we wanted to do was move from proof of concept to try to figure out how are these anti-tumor effects occurring. So the best way to figure that out was to use the patients that had a tumor response. collect their cells at the time the tumor was regressing, and then try to figure out what were they seeing on the cancer, with the idea that if we knew what the target was, then maybe we wouldn't have to do a transplant at all. We could just go after that target antigen with monoclonal antibody, bispecific antibody, things like that. So we have continued to do this research and continue to make discoveries and to publish on it. But the real amazing thing that we discovered in 2008 was that kidney cancer cells, about 85%, have a virus in them called a human endogenous retrovirus, type E, that gets turned on in the tumor, and then pieces of the virus stick on the surface of the cell, and the human immune system can see that virus and can mount an anti-tumor response. That virus is called a RCC virus, Child's-Takahashi renal cell carcinoma virus. They allow us to name the virus after the two of us that discovered it. Takahashi was my postdoctoral fellow, who is absolutely brilliant, has gone back to Nagoya, Japan, and now is the CEO of Nagoya Medical Center. We've now gone to clone the T-cell receptors that recognize peptide antigens from that virus, and we can genetically engineer T-cells to express that T-cell receptor, and then give those back to patients that have metastatic kidney cancer without doing a transplant. Here's a patient with some tumor nodules, got a transplant date at 180. You can see the nodules are shrinking up. We collected those blood immune cells from that patient, and that's what we used to discover this endogenous retrovirus. For those of you that are interested in basic science and molecular biology, through work done by Linda Cherkaskova in our lab, we've discovered that kidney cancer, which has a mutation in the von Hippel-Lindau tumor suppressor gene, overexpresses a transcription factor called HIF2 alpha that binds to a hypoxic responsive element and leads to selective expression of that human endogenous retrovirus, with pieces of it being presented on MHC molecules that are seen by the human immune system. So we've now gone on to take the T-cell receptor that recognizes pieces of that virus, put it into a retroviral vector, and we can make any patient with kidney cancer express that T-cell receptor so that it's able to recognize the patient's tumor and to kill the tumor. So we've been developing this therapy now for about 6 years. We have a patent on it. It was licensed by a company called T-Cure, but we do the first in human studies at the NIH. In mice that we give tumors, if we just give them their own cells back that haven't been genetically engineered, these tumors grow, and these mice have tumor growth and they die. If we give those engineered T cells back, you can see the tumor cells stop growing and these mice survive. And we've now just started giving these T cells back to humans that have metastatic kidney cancer, and this is the third patient that we treated. You can see these scalp lesions regressing, and evidence that the transplanted donor immune system can have activity in that setting. So that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of the scientific part. I'm now going to talk about the administrative stuff, and then we'll talk about the Ebola crisis response. So in 2012, I was asked by our scientific director to assume more of a leadership role in our institute. I was interested in doing that because I was interested in supporting some of our younger scientists to give them an opportunity to have the infrastructure so that they could conduct pivotal cutting-edge research. So I get to work with really super amazing people at the NIH. This is a picture of Dr. Fauci, and have had some good stories that I'll tell you here in a moment. 2 months ago, I became the 8th scientific director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, following a number of really esteemed and brilliant scientists that came before me. So this is a great opportunity for me now to be able to develop some strategic research initiatives, and also to focus on training the next generation of scientists. So the mission statement for the NHLBI is to perform robust scientific and clinical research that leads to a better understanding of the biology and clinical pathology of heart, lung, and blood diseases, and to train the next generation of scientists. So my role as scientific director is to lead that research program, to direct scientific strategic research initiatives, and then importantly to recruit, hire, and train the next generation of outstanding scientists and physician scientists. So our institute has about 1,000 employees. We have a number of investigators, tenure-track investigators, all the way down to trainees. About a quarter of the folks that we have in the institute are trainees. And we've talked today about opportunities potentially for summer students and postbacks to come to the NIH. We have a new fellowship program for our postdocs called the Vaughn Fellowship, which is intended to bring postdocs in and to give them some independent resources so that they can go on have a roadmap to independence early in their career. We also have the Rear Admiral Michoud postbac fellowship for underrepresented scientists, and our goal with this fellowship is to enhance the career opportunities of biomedical scientists for post-bac individuals from health disparity groups that are planning to become doctorally trained either as a PhD scientist or as a physician scientist. And I can tell you this program has been absolutely outstanding. Everybody that's come to this program has gotten to where they want to go, whether it's graduate school or to medical school or to become MD PhDs, and it's been wonderful for me to be able to be a part of this program and to help support this program. So my second pearl, and there's 3 pearls that I have, for those of you that want to say, what the heck was that lecture about, and did he tell you anything that was worthwhile, is that if you get an opportunity to be in a leadership position, that to be the kind of leader that leads by example, and to be a leader and not a boss. And this is just something that I actually took off of Google Images, which I thought said it a lot better than anything I could summarize. But you can get into these power positions, beat your chest, and do things that are for your advantage, or you can do things that are for the advantage of your institution. Lead by example, and by leading by example, everybody contributes to the overall mission of the organization. And that's something that I've always strived to do as a leader. I'm new into the scientific director role, but it is something that I will continue to pursue that philosophy in that role. So the last part of what I want to talk about is the really amazing part of my career that has had to do with public health and public service. So I was commissioned when I became a fellow at the NIH in 1995 as a lieutenant, and I slowly moved up the ranks until I became a captain in 2007, and that's usually where things stop, because it's very difficult to become an admiral. Nobody aspires to be an admiral because nobody can become an admiral. So it's like you got to have a lot of luck for that to happen. I had a lot of luck largely because I was surrounded myself with great teams and great folks. And I'll tell you a little bit of that story. Pearl number 3 is don't be afraid to come out of your comfort zone. Everything for me personally that has advanced my career has been doing something that was out of the box and took me out of my comfort zone. And you will see that some of the greatest learning that occurs in your life is when you do things that you're not used to doing, things that you're not that are not known to you and are outside of that comfort zone. So why do I bring this pearl up now? Because in 2014, actually I was in Greenville visiting my Uncle Harvey when I checked my email and it said, you'll be deployed to West Africa to be part of the United States Ebola crisis response. And I don't remember if Uncle Harvey, if you remember, but I went back and I said to him, oh, they're sending me to West Africa to take care of Ebola patients. And Harvey's like, give me the phone, I'll make some calls and I'll get you out of that. But I really wanted to participate in this because we knew at the time that this was a death sentence for anybody that got infected. And this was an opportunity to bring state-of-the-art medicine to a country, a very low-income country, Liberia initially where it started, and then it went to Sierra Leone and a couple of other countries. But to bring the most advanced medical technology and hopefully be able to turn the curve, to be able to help these poor Africans that were dying from this disease, and then also to hopefully keep it out of the United States by keeping it contained there. So let me tell you about the history of Ebola in West Africa. So as most of you know, Ebola is not a good virus to get. It's highly infectious. It's spread by bodily fluids. At the time, it had a case fatality rate of 97%. Almost every patient that we cared for walked into that Ebola treatment with their head down, demoralized, assuming that this was the end, and they were coming in there largely to quarantine as opposed to actually get any effective care. In December 2013, cases of Ebola were first reported in Guinea, West Africa, and the cases spread to Liberia. By 2014, the largest outbreak in recorded history was now occurring in West Africa. And it was absolutely devastating. By the summer of 2014, half of the healthcare providers in Liberia had been infected with Ebola, and most of them had died. The Liberian health system had completely collapsed. All hospitals were closed, all schools were closed, and things were absolutely spiraling out of control. The WHO in August declared the West Africa Ebola epidemic a public emergency of international concern. This is what they declare right before they declare a pandemic. So things were looking bad. The CDC did a worst case scenario projection that by December 30th, there would be 21,000 cases, and by January 20th, there could be as high as 1.4 million cases. And with the 97% mortality, I think you can quickly appreciate what the impact would be. So President Obama, in September 2014, ordered U.S. troops to Liberia to build Ebola treatment units in the hardest hit Ebola areas of that country. So 21 ETUs, Ebola treatment units, were built. The purpose of those ETUs were mostly to try to pull patients that were infected out of the population as part of a containment goal. But the treatments that were available for those patients were extremely limited. Ebola manifests clinically with high volume diarrhea, high fevers, hypotension, shock, kidney failure, and liver failure. And the only thing that most of those Ebola treatment units had was oral rehydration and fluid. And that's why the mortality rate was so devastatingly high. They didn't even have IV hydration because there was a huge fear about getting blood on you. And if you got any blood on a bare skin surface, you're extremely highly likely to get infected. If you stick yourself with a needle from an Ebola patient, the death rate was 100%. So when we were prepared to take care of these patients, we were obsessed with where the needles were in the field. So anytime somebody had a needle, everybody's eyes were focused on that needle. It's like, where are you sticking that needle? Where are you throwing that needle out? Because if it had Ebola blood on it, you did not want it to stick you. So in October 2014, the President of the United States mobilized our medical team to Monrovia Medical MMU. This MMU, Monrovia Medical Unit, was a state-of-the-art field hospital that was set up in Monrovia, Liberia. And the goal of our unit specifically was to take care of any healthcare providers that got infected with Ebola. Nobody wanted to work in those Ebola treatment units because they knew that if they got infected, they were unlikely to do well. So our job was to bring the best field hospital possible to incentivize those Liberians to say, hey, we need you to take care of your fellow Liberians that are sick. And in the event that you get sick, we're going to take care of you with the best possible medical care. So this was very much a force multiplier for healthcare providers that were there. This is Rear Admiral Giberson, who was the commanding officer, and that's somebody that all of you should know, President Obama, calling everyone to action. So the Department of Homeland Security in Anniston, Alabama, built a mock Ebola treatment unit, and that's where we trained. And we simulated taking care of patients that had Ebola. We simulated, high volume diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and how to clear that, to clean it up, how to decontaminate it using bleach solutions. And that was a really, really intense period of time because we were getting information back from Liberia in terms of how the epidemic was going, what the survival rates were. We were, learning things about like how do you put burial teams together if a patient dies, to be able to bury them and not get infected in the process. Burying dead loved ones was probably the #1 cause for infection. That was the time when people were crying, embracing loved ones, and they were getting infected. This is my team of 70 different officers. We wore PPE all the time to try to get used to it. We knew it was hot in Africa, and wearing PPE when it's 95 or 100 degrees out is not an easy thing to do. So we try to get ourselves acclimated as much as possible. This is our team right before we deployed. That's me right there. That's Captain James Lavelle Dickens, who was the officer in charge, one of the best leaders that I've ever met. I was the chief medical officer for that team. This is us flying over a few hours before we landed in Monrovia to begin our mission. And this was our commanding admiral having given us all a speech, right before we landed. And I'll never forget him encouraging us all to not get infected. Because we knew that if anybody got infected, it was going to reflect very, very poorly on the country in terms of our capabilities from a medical standpoint. And it could be devastating because it literally could wipe out the whole team. So, everybody's back. Our expression was everybody's a safety officer, and if anybody was doing anything wrong, you called them out immediately. There were areas that were called hot zones and non-hot zones, and if anybody was in the hot zone, they did not come out of the hot zone unless they were bleached down. And if you saw them step over a line, you'd have 10 people at the same time going, "Hey!" screaming at them, to get back over, because that was the kind of thing that we were worried could lead to a catastrophe. Everybody got their temperature checked all the time. If you had a fever, you ended up in an Ebola treatment unit. So nobody wanted to get sick over there. So we were paranoid about not having anybody join that team that had routine colds, influenza, stuff like that, because if you had the flu, over there, you had Ebola, and you were in an Ebola treatment unit, and the person sitting next to you really had Ebola. So you had the flu, they had Ebola, and you can imagine where that could lead to. When we arrived to the country, the thing that, was really striking was the poverty and the density of the population. So you can imagine, here's the most lethal virus in recorded history spreading through this country. You're trying to educate the people that are there about, looking out for signs and symptoms. Stay away from anybody that's sick. But with this kind of density, you can just see that it was an absolute setup for it to spread throughout the country. I have to say the librarians are some of the nicest people I ever met. And when we arrived there, as soon as they saw our team, it was just consistent. Thank you for coming over, thank you for helping our country. We all really enjoyed very much caring for these folks. Another thing that was striking was that the death rate was so high that there was nowhere to dispose of the bodies, so there were makeshift graves that were all over the place. So as we drove to the unit, you could literally look at underpasses and see people that had just died from Ebola that were buried. And we knew the virus could stay alive for several weeks after somebody died. So once these bodies, were buried, nobody got near them because of the concern that they could become infected. This is the Monrovia Medical Unit. So this unit was built by the 101st Airborne of the Army. They're famous for a lot of things, but one thing that I learned was Jimi Hendrix was in the 101st Airborne. So this is the Ebola treatment unit. So this is where the patients came in. The ambulance would come in right here through this entrance, and then would bring the patients in right there. And then they would go into these different parts. The pharmacy was over here. We had a laboratory over here. This is where we slept, right here. So we would literally come out here and go through that entrance and come in here, and this is where we would put our PPE on to see the patients and take care for the patients. These are just, a lot of pictures I'm going to show you about this whole experience. A lot of the pictures sort of speak for themselves. This is, just some transition from one team to another team coming over. The teams were built out. There were 300 officers total that participated in this deployment. There were 70 per team. We had MDs, NPs, PAs. Those of you in PA school, I have to say that the PAs made a huge difference over there in terms of our mission success. Nurses, pharmacists, laboratorians, we had safety officers. Their job was just to, being focused to make sure that we were mixing bleach in the right concentrations, that we were donning and doffing in a way that would prevent anybody from getting sick. We had behavioral health providers that were there. I thought initially they were there for the patients that were infected. We later on found out they were there for us because it was just such a stressful environment to be under that you could really lose it because of that kind of stress. This is Rear Admiral Lushniak that came to visit. He was the acting Surgeon General, and this is us giving him a report on what the status of the unit was. He was there one time when we admitted a patient, and we were all nervous because we wanted to make sure that we impressed him, and we thought, okay, he's going to come and give us all kinds of advice and how we can do things better. And we brought the patient in. It was about an hour-and-a-half admission, from when the radio was squawking and saying we have incoming, Ebola patient, to bring him in and everything. And we got done, and he said, I'm not going to change anything. He said, you guys really know what you're doing. And he said, if I change anything, I'm going to mess it up. So he was extremely hands-off with our team. This is one of the ambulances that was used to transport patients in. So you can see this ambulance bringing an Ebola patient in. You can see a safety officer here in full PPE with a bleach wand. So literally everywhere these patients would step, every footprint would be bleached down. Bleach is highly effective at killing lots of things, including RNA viruses. But I mean, this thing looks like something out of a movie. The first time I saw it, it was like, wow. So putting the PPE on took a long time. It took about 20 minutes. The goal was to have no part of your body exposed in the event that there was a blood splash, because any bare skin, potentially you could get infected. So we spent a lot of time putting on the PPE carefully, having at least one person helping us put it on, another person watching it go on. We double gloved, all the glove was taped. This is just a video to show you. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this. I had a video of donning the PPE, but just to show you that it was a very extensive process. Once the PPE was put on, we would go back, usually in teams of 2 to 4. So it would be a doc, a nurse, maybe 2 nurses, a safety officer. I have to say that I don't pray as much as I should, but I prayed a lot on that deployment. And one of the traditions was that before we went back and we saw those patients, we would always do a little prayer huddle. And that huddle, we would say 2 things, and it was, we were praying for the patients, but we were also praying for the medical team as well, that nobody would get infected. This is just showing, more ambulances coming in, bringing a patient. This patient, like many of the patients, was very demoralized when he came in, not expecting to survive. And many of these patients became critically ill. We did have the capability to support them with a full pharmacy cache and with aggressive IV hydration. This is called a PAPR here, which is a completely self-enclosed positive pressure ventilation system that is probably safer than any other type of containment system that was used, but only the safety officers had these. Every time I tried to get a PAPR, they would say, well, we don't have enough. But nobody got infected, fortunately. Here's a patient coming in at night in an ambulance that was critically ill. Unfortunately, this patient did not end up surviving. Taking the PPE off also was an extensive process. You can imagine if you're covered in Ebola juice that you need to bleach down every single part of your body. So taking that PPE off would take anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes. You know, we had a whole team of officers. There was a red line that was here, and you basically would put your arms out, you get bleached down, you wash your hands, you take off a piece of the PPE, put your arms out, you get bleached down. Sometimes you'd be back there for 2 hours and you were dehydrated and you wanted to get that stuff off as quick as possible, but you couldn't because you had to go through the whole process. And we knew from some other Ebola treatment units that this was also one of the areas where people were getting infected, was on the doffing side. So this was the part where you always try to make sure you have a little bit of reserve when you were doffing because you knew it was going to be a 20-minute plus process. So this is just data on 42 patients that were admitted over this time frame to the Ebola treatment unit and demographics on those folks. The best part of working in the unit was witnessing the patients that had Ebola that survived, that were discharged. And this was really what everybody came there for, was, you know, to help patients so that they could ultimately go home. It really was an amazing celebration because, as I said, most of these patients came into this unit with the expectation that they weren't going to survive. So I would describe their emotions as being probably like winning the lottery. So when you would go and you would say, hey, your PCR just turned negative, we need to check it again in 72 hours, and if it's negative again, we're going to be able to send you home. They would look at you like you're making this up. You know, I know I'm going to die, and you're just telling me something. And when they were, you know, ultimately reconfirmed to be negative, then we had a process of, you know, writing a piece of paper to get it so that the community would understand that they had Ebola, they had recovered, they were not infectious, and they could return to the community. I can tell you one thing about Liberians: they love to give speeches. Every one of them, you know, that left would give a 5 to 10 minute speech, sometimes a 20-minute speech. You know, how appreciative they were for the care that we gave them. These are just, you know, patients coming out and being discharged. This is a piece of paper that, you know, describes that this patient is no longer infectious. And you can see that it was a very emotional time for these folks. This is the survival wall where, and remember, these are all healthcare providers. So the goal was to, you know, take care of them, but also get them back to take care of patients. So you can see it says, today I am healed, tomorrow I return to heal another. The love of liberty. Liberty from Ebola brought us here. One of the things that's really cool about surviving Ebola is you're completely immune to it. So we had the idea that these were healthcare providers. They survived Ebola. They were immune to it. Who better to have to work in our unit than people that were completely immune to it? So all of these survivors ended up getting employed at the Monrovia Medical Unit. And when we had to go back in full PPE, they didn't, because they were immune. We also had the opportunity to go from the Monrovia Medical Unit to other Ebola treatment units. Some of these Ebola treatment units were at surge capacity, so it was rewarding to be able to work with these Liberians that were working in in these NGOs. And I have to say that all of them were extremely professional and extremely well-trained during that time. So that mission was an important mission that President Obama had the vision to put together. In the State of the Union address in 2016, President Obama said the response of the United States military, including the Commission Corps fighting Ebola in West Africa, likely saved hundreds of thousands of lives and kept the virus from coming to our homeland. And he gave us, for the first time in our service's history, the Presidential Unit citation, which I have right here. And I was coming up on 20 years, and I figured this was the end of my service. Because of what happened during that deployment, I had an opportunity to go to a flag level to become an admiral. And this is me 8 months later coming back from Liberia, being sworn in as a flag officer with my wife Bernadette Bernie and my son Luke and my daughter Mary. So I figured, okay, I'm a flag officer now, I'll probably train new recruits and wind things down. And this is like an epic and storied career coming to an end. And just when I thought it was over, they pulled me back in. This is for you, Uncle Art, since I'm thinking my uncle was the godfather of Greenland. In early 2000, when we had heard about cases of COVID in China, in the Wuhan prefecture, those of you that sort of follow global events, China had been really successful in containing viruses in that country. And we sort of assumed the same thing was going to happen with this virus. We had experience about SARS, we knew about MERS. We knew MERS was a nasty virus that had a very, very high mortality rate. But the hope was that it would stay in China and would be contained. And then we heard about the Diamond Princess cruise ship that had come out of Yokohama, Japan, had Japanese, Chinese, and a lot of American citizens that were on that ship. COVID started to break out in that ship and started to spread very quickly through. So the government immediately deployed us to Japan with a couple of missions. So one mission was to try to repatriate U.S. citizens in Yokohama, Japan from the Diamond Princess. The second was to try to identify any U.S. citizens that had been infected and were hospitalized throughout Japan so that we could go see them, consult on them for their care. And they were all over the place. They were in 25 different hospitals in that area. And we didn't know when we first got there where the heck they were. So it was our job to find them and to try to help them out and to advocate them. There were 3,809 passengers on board, 692 passengers, or 19% of that ship ultimately got infected with COVID. 52 Americans were hospitalized with COVID. 13 of them became critically ill, requiring ventilatory support. 10 of them required ventilatory support. 4 required ECMO, extracorporeal membranous oxygenation. That's basically a heart-lung bypass machine. The survival rate with ECMO is very, very low. In the U.S., the survival rate is probably 30–40% in adults that go on ECMO. So this was very, very ominous. This was the leadership component of my team. And basically what we did was we had translators. We worked with the U.S. Embassy and the Japanese Ministry of Health, and we basically did tracing, identifying where those Americans were and what their status was. As soon as we realized there were so many that were critically ill, the expectation was we were going to lose a lot of Americans. We contacted Gilead Corporation that made remdesivir that we knew in vitro had activity against COVID. And this is before it was ever given to any human that had COVID. And we worked with that company to get compassionate use remdesivir to Japan to give to critically ill American citizens. So I would go around, see patients, consult on them. This is a chest x-ray of a patient with sort of classic chest x-ray findings with COVID. And we were able to secure remdesivir for a number of Americans. This is a representative of Japan that worked with us to get remdesivir and great support from the Japanese Ministry of Health. The amazing thing was, of those 13 critically ill American citizens, and they were not spring chickens, as many folks are on cruises. The median age was 74, went all the way up to 92. Of those 10 that were mechanically ventilated, all of them were successfully extubated. Now, whether the remdesivir was responsible for them doing so well or not, we don't know. But we were amazed that they did that well. All 4 of those patients on ECMO came off of ECMO, and all 13 of those critically ill Americans survived and were discharged back to the U.S. So this was a successful mission for us because we were able to advocate for our American citizens, secure remdesivir. I give the Gilead Corporation a ton of credit for being so open-minded to allow us to test that agent, which ultimately was tested in randomized clinical trials and was FDA approved for the treatment of COVID. Our team was recognized for this, and we received the Global Health Response Award. So, this was another mission that I didn't expect to come along that came along and ended up being rewarding. So, the picture show is just about over. I just wanted to conclude for the students mostly some final pearls for success after Thiel College, and that is, these are things that I've done that have worked for me, and that's to surround myself with colleagues who have skill sets that you may lack or you may be willing to complement you, to avoid top-down decision-making at all costs. And ever since I've gone into a leadership role at the NIH, I've always pursued feedback, consulted with those around me, and have tried to make sure that any decisions that I make that are going to impact others are decisions that are bottom-up, not top-down. Another thing that's always been important to me, and I would encourage the students from Thiel when you get to a position of leadership, is that you honor those that got you where you are by giving back to the next generation. Right now, you are the next generation, so you can't give back yet. But when you have grown and you will be in a position to train the next generation, I encourage you to do that. And the last thing I want to say is that a career as a public servant can be very rewarding and to consider it. I never intended to be involved in anything that would impact public health. My goal when I went to the NIH was to do some novel research, get trained in oncology, and then go back to the University of Florida. But the opportunity came along for me to participate in research that would impact public health, and then the work in the Commission Corps. And these are things that sometimes you don't plan for, but if those opportunities pop up, consistent with my first pearl, which is think out of the box and come out of your comfort zone, I would encourage you to embrace those opportunities. I just want to stop and conclude and recognize the Greenville, PA Child's Plan, particularly Harvey Childs, who's sitting there in the back corner. Harvey, if you raise your hand, please. For those of you that don't know my uncle, when he had Bail USA, was the biggest bondsman in the country. I think had something like close to 3,000 agents that were working for Bail USA. And he's always been a great supporter of the city of Greenville and for Thiel College. Every night you go to watch a football game when Thiel's playing, you can think about Harvey because he was one of the instrumental people for putting up those night lights. And he's been a great uncle to me. He's been a great mentor. I have to say that some of those pearls that I talked to you about, thinking out of the box, coming out of your comfort zone, I would consult with him, and ask him, hey, what do you think about me staying in longer, trying to be an admiral? And he would say, "Do it!" And his advice was always sage. You know, the other thing that's amazing about my uncle is that he manages to stay relevant in the news. So any of you reading the Herald would have seen last week that retired Green Bosman Childs has ties with O.J. Simpson. I'm not sure that's a good thing. O.J. So, and rumor has it those gloves that didn't fit O.J. fit Harvey. You can make whatever length you want. Really a lucky person to have such a great uncle, and I think Thiel College is really fortunate to have someone that's been such a great supporter of this really amazing college. I had a great tour today, and I have to say that it's a beautiful campus. You know, the students are wonderful, and I really want to try to build some connections with the NIH, and hopefully we'll have some opportunities for the students that are interested in health sciences in terms of summer internships and post-bac types of positions. And then I just want to acknowledge, you know, this amazing place, the NIH, your tax dollars at work. You know, when you hear somebody criticize the NIH, I want you to tell them stop. And that great things come from the NIH. You know, when you look at yourself in the mirror and your teeth aren't rotting out, think about the fluoride that was discovered at the NIH and all the other things that I told you about. It's an amazing, great place to work. And I've been so fortunate to surround myself with incredibly brilliant medical collaborators. You know, you will see discoveries continuing to come from this place. And industry owes the NIH a lot too, because we will do things industry will not engage in. You know, industry wants things that will be successful, that will turn a profit margin. If you're doing research on something that has a 5% chance of being successful, they want nothing to do with it. But once we take that 5% chance and we show that it is successful, they're all over it. And they license it, and they make a lot of money. But they also bring new effective therapies and diagnostics, you know, to patients. So it's a great partnership that we have with industry, and it's great that we have the NIH to be able to do that kind of cutting-edge, high-risk, high-reward research. So thank you for your attention. Absolutely.
Is somebody who would like to ask Dr. Childs a question, comments, thoughts?
Yes, sir.
So in time in Liberia there, or Monrovia?
Monrovia, Liberia. So Monrovia is a city in Liberia. Yeah.
I know you're a very, very restricted area, very small area, with your team there. And kind of crazy situation. You can't go outside the wire, really. Right? What was the greatest leadership challenge you had there? And not only, I guess, motivating people, keeping motivated, but just ensuring that everyone was still staying focused and remaining as a team and not individualizing it.
You just answered it. And that was staying focused. You could not let your guard down for a second. And it got to be monotonous, doing the same thing all the time, doing things that were not gray, but were black and white, and made the difference between being safe and, you know, potentially dying. And we saw after a couple of weeks that people started doing dumb things, really dumb things. And we demobilized a couple of officers that lost their focus. So routine team meetings, reminding, you know, people why we're here. Morale when patients died got impacted. Making sure that everyone understood, keep your eye on the big picture. That day to day there are going to be things that are incredibly demoralizing, but we're in this for the long haul. You know, not for just a couple of hours. But keeping the team focused was really the biggest challenge. There were physical difficulties that we encountered. because of the environment, the heat, wearing the PPE. The first week, getting acclimated was really tough. I mean, I thought one time I literally was going to die because I put the PPE on the first day that we were there, and our plan was have it on for 2 hours so that we could see what it was like to work with it. And when I took it off at 2 hours, I was, in retrospect, dehydrated. I didn't know what was wrong with me, but I had the worst headache of my life, and I remember laying down in my bunk, telling the officer in charge, somebody's going to die in this deployment. And I was actually thinking about myself right at that immediate time. So, physical, when you mix the physical challenge with the emotional stress that comes with something as life-threatening as that, with the death, it all adds up, and it really becomes something that can interfere with your focusing on the mission. And I think this applies to, any type of stressful deployment, whether it's medically related or combat related.
Do you have a question?
You kind of touched on it, but if you wouldn't mind, it might be a little inside baseball, but you touched on the difficulty of wearing the PPE, but looking at the one image, you had markers identifying people.
Yeah.
And having worn the mask during COVID, I'm not equating them, but the difficulty with your glasses fogging up. If you could just talk about managing the petty stuff,
Yeah.
but when it mushrooms, I mean, it all comes back to a head as you're trying to stay focused, but at the same time, even communicating. Like,
Right.
It looked like you had difficulty even identifying who you were working with.
Yeah. I would almost think you were there because of what you're saying, because the goggles fogging up, it was a recurrent problem. When you're fogged up trying to put an IV in somebody with Ebola and you can't see where your hand is or where the needle's going, you can imagine how stressful that is. Sometimes we would get sweat in our goggles and we'd sit there and just use the sweat to try to get the fog off of the goggles. So, amazingly difficult, challenge is the heat. There was an air conditioning system that was air broke all the time. And when it was on, you have one vent for this massive tent and all the officers would be standing underneath that thing, And when you have PPE on, it doesn't really cool you down that much. And the PPE that we wore went from what I think was appropriate for the environment to running out, to where they ended up sending us chemical suits. And the chemical suits are really hot. I mean, so that added, a lot more stress. And then the other thing is that you didn't want to pass out back there. Because if you passed out, it was going to take 20 to 25 minutes to get a team back there to be able to help you. And some of those rooms, we had patients with projectile vomiting and uncontrollable diarrhea. And I made this term Ebola juice. I mean, that's what we called it. It was everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And our guys that would come in and decon these rooms literally were blasting bleach, everywhere, across the floor and everything like that. So, very, very difficult to work in that kind of environment. But the science of how to not get infected worked. And I have to give the CDC a lot of credit. Even the WHO, we took stuff that the WHO was doing and we modified it. But I think that, we were very, very well prepared and, worked around the physical challenges that were there.
Yeah, Lana has a question, and then we'll come back to Dale.
Yes, you've mentioned CDC already, but was your deployment at about the same time when the two healthcare workers were brought back to the U.S. for treatment? The U.S. citizens?
Yeah, so one of those citizens came after we were there. One of the citizens came before, went to Emory, actually went to Nebraska. Emory ended up getting one later on. So some of the the NGO, NGOs had a perfect stellar record for nobody ever getting infected. When we were there, we took confidence in the science because we're like, well, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, never had a volunteer get infected. When we were there, the first healthcare worker got infected. And that, I think, was just because it had always been low volume, and suddenly the volume was increasing. That infection occurred because the patients that were in line to get tested, there was an opening in a fence, and the patient came through and ended up like grabbing one of the healthcare providers. When I came back from Liberia, NIH has one of the few high containment areas called the Special Clinical Studies Unit. And I was back for about 4 weeks, and I thought, okay, that's it for Ebola for the rest of my life. And then I got a call from Dr. Fauci, and he asked me if I would be part of the medical team that would care for an American citizen from Sierra Leone, a physician assistant that got infected who was volunteering at a NGO. So I was, involved in that patient's care for about 6 weeks, and I worked with Dr. Fauci, and it was amazing. He put PPE on and went back and saw that patient multiple times. I mean, you talk about, being hands-on.
Well, we don't hear about Ebola so much anymore. Is there a vaccine or successful treatment?
Yeah.
Why is it under control?
So the strain of Ebola that we were dealing with was Ebola Zaire. And Ebola Zaire, at the time, was sort of the dominant strain that was, hitting different places, particularly in West Africa. There were 2 highly effective vaccines that were developed for Ebola Zaire. And there was a very effective monoclonal antibody. That antibody and the one vaccine were developed in the NIH. So when all this started winding down, I remember telling my wife, someday I'll tell people this Ebola story. And they'll say, you take a vaccine, it's nothing. Ebola is back, but it's not Ebola Zaire. It's Ebola Sudan. Ebola Sudan the vaccines don't work for Ebola Sudan. The monoclonal antibody does not work for Ebola Sudan. So people getting infected with that virus basically have the same outcome as patients that we encountered in 2014. So this is the problem, as you know, with viruses. They're mutating all the time, and you can have different strains, and it's one of the problems with monoclonal antibody therapy. It takes a while to develop those monoclonal antibodies, and once you have them, you may have a period of weeks before the next strain comes in where it doesn't work. The good news with some of the recombinant RNA technology is that we can develop RNA vaccines very, very quickly, and that was certainly the case with COVID. So I think our response time, if we start to get with big outbreaks, will be shorter. You have to also think about the impact of the outbreak and how big it is, and can you get a pharmaceutical company to engage, because they're looking at it in the context of, turning a profit. The last outbreak that I saw was in the Congo, and that was Ebola Sudan. And the U.S. did not participate in any response then for a couple of reasons. One, it was not as large scale as what hit West Africa. The second is the political instability in the Congo. So, Liberia had gone through a civil war, but their government was stable, and the U.S. had close collaborations with Liberia. We had the 101st Airborne Army that was protecting us. So we never were worried about our physical security. But in the Congo, that was a different story, and that's why we didn't deploy there.
Okay, Dale, have the last question?
Dale Dice, industrialist?
Yes, because this was such a severe disease, potentially a world plague, did you and your team have to quarantine when you came back to the United States?
Yes. So we quarantined for 3 weeks. The data that we had was that from an exposure to manifestation of symptoms, that if you were going to manifest symptoms, you'd do so within 21 days. And I'll tell you 2 interesting stories about that. One is that when we were being flown back and demobilized from that deployment, we were around bleach all the time. bleach was being sprayed on us, it was aerosolized, everybody had a bleach cough. They contracted it was a private airline to bring us back. They brought us back in 777. Every seat in the plane was a first class seat. So we're like, oh, the mom was awesome. Flying the whole team back first class. So we get in there, everybody's coughing. Ebola doesn't cause respiratory symptoms, so, it's diarrhea, nausea, vomiting. So we get in the plane, I'm the chief medical officer, so I'm sitting forward right up where the captain is. And he comes out, he's going through his manifest with everybody, and that's when he got told who he was bringing back. And he was pissed. He's like, we have no idea, whatever. So, so we're all exhausted. Plane takes off, I'm sleeping, and I guess we're about an hour into an 8-hour flight. And the OIC comes over to me and he wakes me up and he's like, Captain, you gotta talk to the captain of this flight. He's turning the plane around. I'm like, why? He said, he hears people coughing. He's like, everybody's infected on this damn plane. I'm not coming up with the, group orders. And so I went up there and I said, hey, nobody's infected on this plane. And I said, we all wear PPE. He's like, everyone's coughing. And I said, it's a bleach cough. So probably my greatest contribution to that deployment was I prevented that plane from turning around and coming back to Liberia and getting stuck in it. When I came back to the States, we got quarantined in this place called the Hague for a couple of days, and then they basically said, if you guys have a place that you can go to where you won't be around anybody, you can self-quarantine. So my family has a home on the Chesapeake Bay, so I quarantined in that place. And up to that point, I had never drank whiskey, scotch, or anything, but everybody felt sorry for me. They kept leaving scotch at the front door. So that's when I became a scotch drinker. And then I remember one day I went outside to get some sun, and my neighbor who looks like, who actually spends a lot of time in West Virginia, and I stepped out and he looked at me and he goes, get your ass back in that house. And he meant it, and like, get back in there and don't come outside. So, people were appropriately, alarmed. But, our concern that we were going to spread the U.S. was zero because, we had adequate containment procedures. We also checked our temperature 4 times a day. And nobody from the team got infected. So I think we proved that the science and prevention for managing this was effective. Yeah.
Well, join me in thanking Dr. Childs for his